The bitter wind of November 1878 cut through Cedar Falls like a blade, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and the desperate prayers of families who knew winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. In the town square, beneath the shadow of the courthouse steps that had witnessed more heartbreak than justice, a crowd gathered with the reluctant duty of vultures drawn to carrion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today was settlement day, when the debts of the dead came calling on the living, and the O'Brien sisters stood in a line like beautiful birds with clipped wings, waiting to discover what price their freedom would command. 7 young women, each bearing the unmistakable mark of Irish heritage in their auburn hair and emerald eyes, faced a sea of calculating stares and whispered appraisals. The eldest, Mary, kept her chin raised with the dignity of someone who refused to let circumstances diminish her worth, while her youngest sister Grace clung to her skirt with fingers that trembled despite her determination to be brave. Between them stood Catherine, Elizabeth, Margaret, Rose, and Anne, each processing their fate in their own way, but all united by the unbreakable bond of blood and shared survival. Jake Sullivan sat astride his chestnut mare at the edge of the gathering, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better days and harder trails. Everything about his posture spoke of a man who had learned to observe before acting, to measure twice before cutting once, and to trust his instincts when the world around him lost its moral compass. He hadn't intended to come to town today. The cattle needed moving to winter pasture, and the fence line along his eastern boundary required mending before the first serious snow made such work impossible. But his mare had thrown a shoe 3 miles out, and fate had a peculiar way of placing a man exactly where he needed to be, whether he welcomed the destination or not. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty square and highlighting the desperate tableau unfolding before the courthouse. Jake had heard about the O'Brien situation, as had most folks in 3 counties. Seamus O'Brien had been a dreamer and a fool, borrowing against future claims that existed more in hope than reality. When the mine collapse took him and his wife last spring, it left behind 7 daughters and enough debt to sink a riverboat. The Blackwood Mining Company had been patient. They could afford to be, but patience had limits when winter approached, and cash flow demanded attention. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like grinding gears, consulted his papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long since stopped seeing human faces in his transactions. Next item, folks, Lot 23. 7 sisters, ages 16 to 24. Recently orphaned, no outstanding debts of their own, but bound by territorial law to settle their father's obligations to the Blackwood Mining Company and associated creditors. Terms are 5 years indentured service, or until debt is satisfied in full. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the clinical description of human lives, reduced to legal terminology. He had heard about debt auctions, of course. Every rancher in the territory knew the law. But witnessing the reality was different from understanding the concept. The legal books called it voluntary servitude, a clean way to avoid debtor's prison, while ensuring creditors received compensation. Usually, it involved single individuals sold to farmers needing extra hands or wealthy families seeking domestic help. 7 sisters sold together was unprecedented, a situation that stretched the boundaries of an already questionable practice. Mary O'Brien stood at the front of the group, her dark green dress carefully mended but clean, her posture erect despite the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from holding a family together through circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, revealing a face that combined delicate features with an iron determination that reminded Jake of the Celtic warriors his grandfather used to describe in stories told by firelight. Behind her, the other sisters arranged themselves in descending order of age, each dealing with their situation according to their individual temperament. Catherine, just 2 years younger than Mary, stood with clenched fists and eyes that promised trouble for anyone who tried to separate them. Elizabeth, 20 years old and gentle as spring rain, kept one protective arm around Rose, whose artistic soul was struggling to process the harsh reality of their circumstances. Margaret, barely 18 but sharp as a tack, was already calculating odds and possibilities with the practical intelligence that had helped them survive the months since their parents' death. Anne, at 19, maintained the stoic composure that had made her the family's unofficial mediator during difficult times. And Grace, sweet 16, and trying desperately to be brave, represented everything pure and innocent that the world seemed determined to corrupt. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air with practiced authority. The O'Brien sisters worked their father's farm until his death. All are literate, skilled in domestic arts, and accustomed to hard work. The eldest 3 have experience with livestock and farming. The younger ones show aptitude for household management and food preparation. The debt in question totals $600, a sum that represents 5 years of combined labor at territorial wage standards. Jake knew about the O'Brien farm, had ridden past it many times during his trips to and from town. Seamus had worked that land with the stubborn determination of a man who believed hard work could overcome any obstacle. But he had also borrowed against every season's hope, every potential discovery, every optimistic projection that mining company representatives had whispered in his ear during moments of desperation. When the mine collapse claimed both parents in a single terrible afternoon, it left 7 young women to face the consequences of dreams that had turned to nightmares. "Let us start the bidding at $40, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the square like the crack of a whip. $40 for 5 years of service from 7 healthy young women represents exceptional value for any farming operation or large household requiring domestic staff. Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. $40 was good money for a single servant, but taking responsibility for 7 sisters meant housing, feeding, and managing a group that came with complicated dynamics and potential complications. Everyone present understood they were bidding on more than just labor. 7 young women without family protection were vulnerable in ways that made decent men uncomfortable and indecent men calculating. From the back of the crowd, a gravelly voice called out $35, and I'll take just the 3 oldest. Don't need the burden of caring for children. Jake turned to see Victor Blackwood himself pushing through the gathering, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as clearly as a brand marks cattle. Blackwood owned the largest mining operation in the territory, along with half the businesses in Cedar Falls and a reputation for treating employees like expendable equipment. His offer to split the sisters sent a visible shudder through the group, and Jake watched Mary's protective instincts flare as she stepped slightly in front of her younger siblings. The crowd stirred uneasily at Blackwood's bid. Separating the sisters went against the spirit of keeping families together, but it wasn't technically illegal if no one bid on the complete group. Mary's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure, scanning the crowd with eyes that held both defiance and desperate hope. She was searching for someone, anyone, who might see them as human beings rather than convenient labor. $50 for all 7, called another voice, this one belonging to Luther Grimm, who owned the territory's largest saloon and the questionable establishments that surrounded it. Grimm was a big man with small eyes and a reputation for making inconvenient people disappear. His girls, as he called the women who worked his establishments, had a disturbing tendency to vanish after a year or 2, usually in the middle of the night with nothing but terror in their eyes and mysterious injuries that prevented them from talking about their experiences. The implications of Grimm's bid hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Everyone present understood what kind of work he was offering, and the thought of 7 innocent sisters subjected to that fate made even the most callous observers shift uncomfortably. Catherine O'Brien's composure cracked at Grimm's offer, her hands clenching into fists as she stepped forward with the clear intention of voicing her objections. But Mary caught her arm and whispered something that made her younger sister step back, though the fire in her eyes never dimmed. Jake had seen enough evil in his 28 years to recognize it in all its forms. During his cavalry service, he had witnessed the casual cruelty that men could inflict on the defenseless when they believed no one was watching or caring. He had seen communities destroyed by greed, families torn apart by forces beyond their control, and good people crushed by circumstances that could have been prevented if someone with power had chosen to act with decency instead of profit. The bidding continued in fits and starts, voices calling out numbers while the 7 sisters stood frozen in the center of it all. Jake watched their faces cycle through emotions: fear, disgust, resignation, and beneath it all, the desperate hope that someone might see them as worth saving rather than merely exploiting. They were trapped by laws they had no voice in making, bound by debts they had never chosen to incur, facing a future that promised nothing but servitude regardless of who emerged victorious from this degrading spectacle. $60, Blackwood called, his voice sharp with impatience. Final offer, and I maintain my preference for splitting the group. The older ones are worth the investment, but feeding and housing 7 people through winter represents a significant expense that younger ones cannot offset through immediate productivity. The crowd murmured its understanding of Blackwood's business logic, but Jake found himself studying the faces of the 7 sisters and seeing something that transcended mere economic calculation. These young women had survived the loss of their parents, held their family together through months of uncertainty, and maintained their dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many people. They possessed the kind of strength that came from genuine love and mutual support, qualities that had nothing to do with their monetary value, but everything to do with their worth as human beings. $75, Grimm countered, his voice oily with satisfaction. And I'll take all 7. Got plenty of room in my establishment, and I can think of numerous ways for young women to earn their keep. His laugh was the kind that made decent people look at their boots, and indecent people lit their lips in anticipation. Mary O'Brien's face went white as a sheet, and Grace began to cry silently, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized what their fate might entail. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around her youngest sister, while Anne and Margaret flanked them protectively. Rose, whose artistic soul made her particularly sensitive to emotional currents, looked like she might faint from the horror of contemplating what awaited them. Catherine appeared ready to fight the entire crowd barehanded, rather than submit to Grimm's intentions. Jake had reached his limit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had spent years after the war trying to live quietly, avoiding entanglements that might resurrect the ghosts that haunted his dreams. He had built his ranch as a fortress against the world's cruelty, a place where a man could exist without witnessing the casual evil that seemed to flourish wherever human beings gathered in groups. But sometimes a man faced a moment that defined not just his immediate future, but his fundamental character. And this was such a moment. $200, Jake called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. The square fell silent as every head turned toward the lone rider, who had just entered a bid that dwarfed all previous offers. $200 was serious money, enough to buy a small ranch or finance a year's worth of operations for most businesses. For an indentured servitude contract, it was unheard of, an amount that transformed the entire nature of the transaction. The auctioneer blinked, clearly struggling to process the astronomical bid. Did you say $200, Mr. Sullivan? Jake Sullivan, yes. $200 for all 7 sisters to be kept together as a family unit. The last part was important, establishing his intention to honor the bonds between the siblings rather than treating them as individual commodities. Blackwood spun around, his face flushed with anger and confusion. You cannot be serious, Sullivan. That amount represents throwing good money after bad. What possible use could you have for 7 women on a cattle ranch? Your operation is barely large enough to support 1 man, let alone a household of 8 people. Jake met Blackwood's gaze steadily, reading the frustration and calculation behind the mining owner's eyes. Blackwood had expected to acquire valuable labor at bargain prices, possibly splitting the sisters to maximize their individual utility while minimizing his investment. Jake's bid had destroyed that strategy, forcing Blackwood to either pay far more than he had planned or abandon his pursuit entirely. My money, my business, Jake replied evenly. As for their utility, I imagine 7 intelligent women can find ways to contribute to ranch operations that might surprise you. The response was deliberately vague, designed to frustrate Blackwood's curiosity while avoiding specific commitments that might complicate future arrangements. Grim urged his horse closer, his face twisted with the kind of anger that came from losing something he had considered already won. $250, he snarled, desperation creeping into his voice. And I guarantee they will earn every penny of that. Investment through specialized services that your ranch cannot possibly provide. Jake felt his stomach turn at the man's obvious implications. But he kept his expression neutral as he considered his response. $200 represented most of his savings, money he had scraped together over 3 years of careful living and successful cattle drives. Raising his bid to match Grimm's offer would leave him dangerously short of operating capital, potentially threatening his ability to maintain the ranch through the coming winter. But some things mattered more than financial security, and the thought of 7 innocent women subjected to Grimm's particular brand of exploitation made the choice clear. $300, Jake said quietly, the words carrying across the silent square like a death knell for his competitor's hopes. The amount represented not just money, but a complete commitment to changing his life in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. Taking responsibility for 7 women meant abandoning the solitary existence he had carefully constructed, opening his home and his heart to possibilities that terrified him more than any cavalry charge he had ever faced. The crowd stirred uneasily, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond a simple labor transaction. $300 was ranch money, enough to start over somewhere new or live comfortably for several years. Jake Sullivan was paying a price that suggested motivations no one could easily understand, transforming what should have been a routine debt settlement into something approaching legend. Grimm's face had gone purple with rage, but even he recognized the futility of matching such an offer. $300 exceeded the annual income of most territorial businesses, representing an investment that could never be recouped through conventional labor arrangements. Whatever Sullivan's reasons for making such a bid, they clearly transcended economic calculation, entering territory that made practical men uncomfortable. Blackwood attempted one last strategic maneuver, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than honest competition. Mr. Sullivan, I believe you are acting rashly, without full consideration of the responsibilities you are assuming. 7 women require not just housing and food, but protection, guidance, and constant supervision. Are you prepared for such obligations? Jake looked directly at Mary O'Brien, reading the mixture of hope and wariness in her eyes. She had heard promises before, had trusted men who claimed to have her family's best interests at heart, and had learned that words were cheaper than the air used to speak them. Whatever arrangements he made with the O'Brien sisters would need to be built on actions rather than assurances, proven through daily choices rather than grand gestures. "I understand the responsibilities," Jake replied, his gaze returning to Blackwood. "With steady determination, and I accept them willingly. The sisters will be treated with respect, housed properly, and given the protection they deserve. Their family bonds will be honored, and their individual dignity will be maintained. Anyone who has problems with those arrangements can discuss their concerns with me directly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced armed enemies and emerged victorious. Jake Sullivan might live alone and avoid trouble, but he possessed the skills and determination to handle whatever challenges his decision might create. Blackwood and Grimm were welcome to test his resolve, but they should understand that he was prepared to defend his choices with whatever force proved necessary. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice uncertain as he struggled to process the morning's unexpected developments. Debt auctions were supposed to be straightforward affairs where desperate people went to the lowest bidders. Jake Sullivan had transformed this particular transaction into something entirely different, establishing precedents that would reshape how such proceedings were conducted throughout the territory. Going twice, the auctioneer continued, looking around the crowd for any last-minute challenges to Jake's unprecedented bid. But the silence stretched unbroken, punctuated only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards beyond town. $300 had effectively ended all competition, establishing Jake Sullivan as either the most generous fool or the most mysterious benefactor in Cedar Falls history. "Sold," the auctioneer finally declared, his voice cracking slightly. "On the word." To Jake Sullivan for $300, the complete family group consisting of 7 sisters, to be maintained as a single unit for the duration of their service obligation. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising and excited speculation about the morning's extraordinary events. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dusty ground with quiet authority as he approached the platform where the 7 sisters waited with expressions ranging from relief to bewilderment. He had just committed himself to changing 7 lives, but in the process, he suspected his own existence was about to be transformed in ways he could not yet begin to imagine. Mary O'Brien stepped forward as he reached the platform, her green eyes searching his face for clues about his intentions and character. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled strength of someone who had learned to lead through crisis rather than comfort. "I am Mary O'Brien, and these are my sisters. We need to understand what you expect from us, what arrangements you have in mind, and what our lives will be like under your authority." It was a fair question, delivered with the directness of someone who had learned that uncertainty was often more dangerous than unwelcome truth. Jake respected her courage in asking, understanding that she was protecting her sisters in the only way available to her. The indenture contract gave him legal authority over their lives for the next 5 years, along with the responsibility to house, feed, and direct their work as he saw fit. On paper, they were little more than property, bound to his service until their father's debts were satisfied. "What I expect," Jake said simply, "is for you to help me run a ranch. Nothing more, nothing less. You will have decent housing, adequate food, and the respect due to any person working honest labor. Your family will stay together, and your individual dignity will be maintained. Anyone who cannot accept those terms is welcome to speak up now. Because once we leave this square, those arrangements become permanent." Catherine O'Brien, whose fiery temperament had been barely contained during the auction, stepped forward with the challenging stance of someone who refused to be intimidated by circumstances or authority. "And what if we cannot do ranch work? What if we are not strong enough or skilled enough for such labor? What happens to my sisters if we fail to meet your expectations?" Jake studied her face, reading the protective instincts that drove her questions. Catherine was testing him, probing for weaknesses or cruel intentions that might endanger her family. Her suspicion was warranted, born from experience with men who made promises they had no intention of keeping. Trust would need to be earned through actions rather than words, proven through daily choices rather than eloquent speeches. Strength can be built, Jake replied evenly, and skills can be learned. What matters is willingness to try, to contribute what you can while learning what you must. This ranch has survived with one person doing all the work. 7 people, even inexperienced ones, can certainly manage what I have been handling alone. The question is not whether you can meet my expectations, but whether I can provide the guidance and support you need to succeed. His response seemed to surprise them, suggesting a partnership rather than a master-servant relationship. Most men in his position would have emphasized their authority and the sisters' obligations, but Jake was proposing something closer to mutual cooperation. It was an unusual approach to an indenture arrangement, one that promised possibilities none of them had dared to hope for during the dark months since their parents' death. Elizabeth, the gentlest of the sisters, spoke up with the soft voice of someone more comfortable with animals than people. "Mr. Sullivan, what about living arrangements? Where will we stay, and how will our privacy be protected?" Her question reflected concerns that went beyond simple housing, touching on issues of safety and dignity that were particularly relevant for young women in their situation. Jake had been dreading this question, knowing how it would sound regardless of how he answered. The ranch house was large enough to accommodate everyone, but barely. His uncle had built it with the expectation of eventually housing a large family, but Jake had been using only a fraction of the available space, converting the unused rooms into proper quarters for 7 women would require significant work, but it was certainly possible. "The house has enough room for everyone," Jake said carefully. 7 bedrooms that can be made comfortable with some work, plus common areas for meals and gatherings. You will have locks on your doors and privacy when you need it. My quarters are separate from yours, and I will respect those boundaries absolutely. Anyone who violates those arrangements will answer to me personally. The last part was directed as much toward potential future problems as present concerns, establishing his intention to protect the sisters from any threats that might arise. Ranch life could be isolated and dangerous, attracting men who might see 7 young women as opportunities rather than people deserving respect. Jake was making it clear that such attitudes would not be tolerated, backed by whatever force proved necessary to maintain that standard. Rose, whose artistic sensibilities made her particularly attuned to emotional undercurrents, asked the question that was probably weighing on all their minds. "Mr. Sullivan, why did you do this? Pay so much money for people you do not know. What do you hope to gain from such an arrangement?" It was the most difficult question to answer honestly, requiring Jake to examine motivations he was not entirely sure he understood himself. The simple truth was that watching 7 innocent women face such degrading circumstances had awakened something in him that years of solitary living had not managed to kill. Perhaps it was basic human decency, or maybe it was the memory of other women he had failed to help when help was desperately needed. Whatever the reason, he had reached a point where standing by and doing nothing was no longer acceptable. "I suppose," Jake said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I reached a point where I could not watch good people suffer when I had the power to help them. Your family has been through enough hardship without enduring what those other bidders had. In mind, sometimes a man has to act on his principles, regardless of the cost or consequences." His answer seemed to satisfy them, at least temporarily, though Jake suspected they would continue evaluating his character through his actions rather than his words. Trust would need to be built gradually, proven through daily interactions and consistent behavior. The sisters had learned to be cautious about men who made grand gestures, understanding that such displays often came with hidden prices and unspoken expectations. Grace, the youngest sister, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up with the clear voice of someone who had reached her own conclusions about their situation. Mr. Sullivan, will we be able to write letters? To stay in contact with friends from town and receive mail if people want to write to us? Her question revealed an intelligence and maturity that belied her 16 years, showing that she understood the importance of maintaining connections to the outside world. Isolation was often the first step toward abuse, cutting victims off from potential sources of help or witnesses to mistreatment. By asking about correspondence, Grace was establishing her intention to maintain the independence and dignity that their circumstances might otherwise compromise. Of course, Jake replied without hesitation, "You are not prisoners, and this ranch is not a prison. You have the right to communicate with anyone you choose, to receive visitors when appropriate, and to maintain whatever connections you value. The only restrictions are those necessary for everyone's safety and the practical requirements of ranch work." Anne, whose practical nature made her focus on immediate concerns, asked about their possessions and the few belongings they had managed to salvage from their family home. "We have some personal items, clothing, and keepsakes from our parents. Will we be able to keep those things, to have them with us at the ranch?" Jake nodded, understanding that such possessions represented far more than their material value. They were links to happier times, reminders of parents who had loved them, and anchors to identities that transcended their current circumstances. Protecting those connections was essential to maintaining the sisters' emotional well-being and sense of self-worth. "Everything you own remains yours," he assured them. "Bring whatever you can carry, and if there are larger items you value, we can arrange to transport them later. Your personal belongings are not part of this arrangement, and your privacy regarding them will be absolutely respected." Margaret, whose sharp intelligence had been analyzing every aspect of their situation, asked the most practical question of all, "Mr. Sullivan, what happens if this arrangement does not work out? If there are conflicts or problems that cannot be resolved? Do we have any recourse, or are we bound to endure whatever develops?" It was a shrewd question that revealed Margaret's understanding of their legal vulnerability. The indenture contract gave Jake considerable authority over their lives, with limited recourse available if he chose to abuse that power. Most territorial officials would side with property owners in disputes involving indentured servants, making protection dependent on Jake's personal integrity rather than institutional safeguards. If serious problems develop that cannot be resolved through discussion and compromise, Jake said carefully, "I will work with territorial authorities to find alternative arrangements that protect your welfare. Your safety and dignity are more important than any contract or legal obligation. I will not hold you against your will if circumstances make this arrangement untenable." His response went well beyond legal requirements, suggesting a flexibility and concern for their welfare that none of them had expected. Most men in his position would have emphasized their authority and the sisters' obligations, but Jake was proposing something closer to mutual agreement than forced servitude. It was an unusual approach that promised possibilities they had not dared to hope for. The practical arrangements concluded, Jake helped each sister down from the platform, noting how they maintained their protective formation even in this moment of transition. Mary remained at the front, ready to shield her siblings from any unexpected threats. Catherine stayed alert and ready for trouble, her fierce loyalty evident in every gesture. Elizabeth and Anne flanked the younger girls, while Margaret, Rose, and Grace stayed close together, drawing strength from their family bonds. As they walked through the square toward where Jake's wagon waited, the sisters attracted stares and whispered conversations from the dispersing crowd. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, a transaction that transcended normal business arrangements and entered territory that would be discussed for years to come. Jake Sullivan had paid an unprecedented price, for reasons no one could easily understand, transforming what should have been a routine debt settlement into something approaching legend. The wagon ride to the Broken Wheel Ranch would take the better part of the day, providing time for the sisters to process their changed circumstances and for Jake to begin understanding the responsibilities he had assumed. 7 women with different personalities, skills, and needs represented challenges he could not yet fully comprehend, but also possibilities that might transform his isolated existence into something richer and more meaningful than anything he had previously imagined. As they left Cedar Falls behind, the 7 sisters sat in the wagon bed, surrounded by the few possessions they had managed to salvage from their former life, facing an uncertain future with the courage that had carried them through months of hardship and loss. Jake drove in thoughtful silence, acutely aware that his decision to bid on their freedom had committed him to a path from which there would be no turning back, regardless of what challenges and complications lay ahead. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the dusty road as they rolled away from Cedar Falls, each turn taking the O'Brien sisters further from everything they had known and closer to an uncertain future that rested entirely in the hands of a stranger. Jake Sullivan maintained his steady pace, mindful of the precious cargo he carried, while his mind wrestled with the magnitude of what he had undertaken. $300 was more than most men earned in 2 years, but the financial cost paled in comparison to the emotional responsibility he had assumed. 7 lives now depended on his judgment, his character, and his ability to transform a bachelor's retreat into a home suitable for a family he had acquired through legal transaction, rather than natural affection. The eldest sister, Mary, sat with her back straight and her eyes alert, cataloging every landmark and calculating distances with the practical mindset of someone who had learned never to trust completely in another person's goodwill. At 24, she had shouldered the burden of family leadership since their parents' death, making decisions that kept her sisters fed and together while their world crumbled around them. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she turned to study Jake's profile, searching for clues about the man who had just purchased their freedom at a price that defied all rational explanation. Catherine, whose fiery temperament had been barely contained during the auction, now channeled that same intensity into protective vigilance. Her green eyes swept the surrounding countryside, noting potential escape routes and defensible positions with the instincts of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. At 22, she possessed the kind of fierce loyalty that would make her dangerous to anyone who threatened her family, but also potentially troublesome for anyone trying to establish authority over their group. Jake sensed her wariness like heat from a forge, understanding that earning Catherine's trust would require more than words or gestures. Elizabeth, gentle by nature but strong in crisis, had positioned herself between the younger sisters and the wagon's edge, creating a human barrier against any sudden movements or unexpected dangers. Her 20 years had been marked by kindness rather than conflict, but recent events had taught her that gentleness could not always protect those she loved. She watched Jake with the careful attention of someone evaluating whether he represented safety or simply a different form of threat, her delicate features marked by premature lines of worry that spoke to burdens no young woman should have to carry. Margaret, despite being only 18, possessed an intelligence that had kept the family functioning during their darkest months. Her quick mind was already working through the practical implications of their new situation, calculating resources, evaluating possibilities, and preparing contingency plans for various scenarios. She had inherited her father's head for figures and her mother's gift for organization, qualities that had proven invaluable during the chaos following their parents' death. Now she applied those same skills to understanding Jake Sullivan and determining whether his intentions matched his actions. Rose, at 17, struggled more than her sisters with the harsh realities they faced. Her artistic soul had found beauty and meaning in their previous life, creating sketches and paintings that captured the joy their family had shared despite their modest circumstances. The auction had shattered something precious in her worldview, forcing her to confront ugliness she had never imagined possible. She sat quietly in the wagon, her sensitive nature absorbing the emotional currents swirling around their group while she tried to reconcile her dreams with their current reality. Anne, 19 and practical to her core, had spent the journey mentally inventorying their possessions and planning how to establish household routines in whatever accommodations awaited them. Her skills in cooking, cleaning, and domestic management had kept the family fed and clothed during their months of poverty, and she understood that demonstrating their value as workers might be crucial to ensuring fair treatment. She studied the landscape with an eye toward resources and opportunities, already thinking about gardens, livestock management, and the countless details that would determine their quality of life. Grace, the youngest at 16, possessed a wisdom that often surprised adults who underestimated her based on her age. Her innocent appearance concealed a sharp intelligence and emotional maturity that had developed through necessity rather than choice. She watched Jake with the unblinking attention of someone who had learned to read adult moods and intentions as a matter of survival, understanding that their future comfort and safety depended largely on the character of this silent man who had paid such an extraordinary price for their freedom. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle and sheep, past farms where families worked their land with the determined optimism that characterized frontier life. Jake pointed out landmarks and neighbors' properties as they traveled, his voice carrying the quiet pride of someone who had found his place in the world and worked hard to deserve it. The Broken Wheel Ranch lay 15 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, far enough from town to provide privacy and independence, but close enough to maintain connections with civilization when necessary. As the afternoon progressed, Jake found himself stealing glances at his passengers, noting how they interacted with each other and processed their changing circumstances. The bonds between the sisters were obvious in countless small gestures: Mary's protective hand on Grace's shoulder, Catherine's fierce glare at any potential threat, Elizabeth's gentle encouragement of Rose's fragile spirits, Margaret's quiet consultation with Anne about practical matters. They functioned as a unit, each sister contributing her strengths while relying on the others to compensate for her weaknesses. It was the kind of family cohesion that Jake had witnessed rarely during his military service and never in his civilian life. The conversation that developed during their journey revealed depths of character that the auction setting had not allowed to surface. Mary spoke with the measured authority of someone who had learned leadership through crisis, her words carrying weight because they were chosen carefully and spoken with conviction. Catherine's contributions crackled with intelligence and passion, revealing a mind that could be either a powerful ally or a formidable opponent, depending on how she was treated. Elizabeth's gentle observations showed a sensitivity to human nature that could prove invaluable in building the trust necessary for their unusual arrangement to succeed. Margaret's questions demonstrated a practical intelligence that impressed Jake with its scope and sophistication. She understood the economics of ranch operations, the challenges of feeding and housing 8 people through a mountain winter, and the delicate balance between cooperation and independence that would determine whether their arrangement prospered or failed. Her insights suggested that the O'Brien sisters possessed resources beyond their physical labor, intellectual and emotional assets that could contribute significantly to the ranch's success if properly utilized. Rose's occasional comments revealed an artistic perspective that found beauty in landscapes Jake had learned to see purely in terms of grass quality and water access. Her ability to appreciate aesthetic elements reminded him of aspects of life he had neglected during his years of solitary existence, suggesting that the sisters might enrich his experience in ways he had not anticipated. Anne's observations about household management and domestic efficiency demonstrated skills that could transform his bachelor quarters into a real home, while Grace's innocent questions often cut to the heart of complex issues with the clarity that only children and poets could achieve. As they crested a hill that provided their first view of the Broken Wheel Ranch, Jake felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at showing his property to people whose opinions had suddenly become important to him. The ranch spread across a natural valley, protected by hills on 3 sides and watered by a clear stream that never ran dry, even in the driest summers. The house, built by his uncle with frontier optimism and Eastern ambitions, was larger than most ranch dwellings, constructed from local stone and timber with the solid craftsmanship that characterized German immigrant work. The barn dominated the central yard, its red paint faded but its structure sound, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke to the property's livestock focus. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures that extended beyond the immediate yard, while horses occupied a separate paddock closer to the house. Gardens and orchards planted by his uncle's wife showed signs of neglect but retained enough structure to suggest their former productivity. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work, of dreams pursued with determination even when circumstances proved challenging. Mary's first reaction was relief that the property appeared prosperous and well-maintained, rather than the marginal operation she had feared. A successful ranch meant security for her sisters, steady work that could lead to fair treatment, and living conditions that might approach comfort rather than mere survival. She noted the size of the house, the quality of the outbuildings, and the obvious care that had gone into planning the layout, all signs that Jake Sullivan was a competent manager who took pride in his property. Catherine's assessment focused on defensive considerations and escape routes, her military mindset evaluating the ranch as a potential fortress or prison depending on how events developed. The valley's natural protection could work for them or against them, providing security from outside threats while potentially limiting their options if Jake proved untrustworthy. She noted the distances to neighboring properties, the availability of horses, and the multiple trails that led away from the ranch, filing away information that might prove crucial if circumstances required rapid departure. Elizabeth's gentle nature responded to the beauty of the setting, appreciating the way the house nestled into the landscape as if it belonged there naturally. The gardens called to her nurturing instincts, promising opportunities to create beauty and productivity that could benefit everyone. She saw potential for flower beds, vegetable plots, and herb gardens that could provide both practical benefits and emotional satisfaction, giving her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Margaret's practical intelligence immediately began, calculating the ranch's carrying capacity, resource requirements, and potential for expansion or improvement. She noted the quality of the grazing land, the adequacy of water supplies, the condition of fences and structures, and the overall efficiency of the operations layout. Her assessment suggested that Jake had inherited or created a valuable property, one that could certainly support 8 people if managed properly. Rose found her artistic eye drawn to the play of light across the valley, the way the mountains framed the ranch buildings like a natural cathedral, and the harmony between human construction and natural landscape. For the first time since the auction, she felt a stirring of hope that this place might offer opportunities for beauty and creativity rather than merely grinding labor. The setting possessed the kind of grandeur that could inspire art if she was given the freedom and materials to pursue such interests. Anne's domestic experience allowed her to evaluate the house's potential as a family dwelling, noting the kitchen facilities, the apparent number of rooms, and the practical considerations that would determine their daily comfort. The property appeared to offer adequate space and resources for establishing proper household routines, suggesting that their living conditions might be considerably better than anything they had experienced since their parents' death. Grace's youthful optimism responded to the ranch's promise of adventure and new experiences, seeing possibilities for exploration, learning, and growth that had been absent from their recent struggles for survival. The horses particularly caught her attention, representing freedom and capability that she had dreamed of but never experienced. Her excitement was infectious, reminding her sisters that their situation, however uncertain, offered opportunities as well as risks. As they approached the house, Jake found himself seeing his property through their eyes, noting details he had long taken for granted and recognizing areas where improvements would be necessary to accommodate their needs. The house would require significant work to prepare adequate living quarters for 7 women, while the domestic arrangements would need complete reorganization to provide appropriate privacy and comfort. He had committed himself not just to housing the sisters, but to creating conditions where they could thrive rather than merely survive. The conversation during their final approach to the ranch revealed the complexity of personalities and relationships that Jake would need to understand and navigate. Mary's questions demonstrated her concern for establishing clear expectations and boundaries, ensuring that her sisters knew what was expected of them while protecting their dignity and rights. Catherine's challenges tested Jake's patience and authority, probing for weaknesses or cruel intentions that might threaten their safety. Elizabeth's gentle inquiries about their daily routines and responsibilities showed her desire to contribute meaningfully while maintaining the family bonds that had sustained them through crisis. Margaret's practical concerns about resource allocation, work assignments, and long-term planning revealed her understanding that their success would depend on efficient organization and clear communication. Rose's tentative questions about opportunities for creative expression suggested depths of talent that could enrich their community if encouraged and supported. Anne's focus on domestic arrangements demonstrated her readiness to assume responsibility for household management, while Grace's curiosity about the animals and landscape showed her eagerness to embrace their new environment. Jake's responses to their various concerns and questions established the tone for their future relationship, balancing authority with respect, setting necessary boundaries while demonstrating flexibility and consideration for their individual needs. His answers revealed a man who had thought seriously about the responsibilities he was assuming, who understood that success would require cooperation rather than coercion, and who possessed the patience and wisdom necessary to guide their unusual family through the challenges that lay ahead. As they finally drew up before the ranch house, the 7 sisters prepared to begin a new chapter in their lives, one that would test their resilience, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately determine whether Jake Sullivan's extraordinary investment would prove to be inspired generosity or costly folly. The next few hours would establish patterns and expectations that would shape their relationships for years to come, as they began the delicate process of transforming strangers into family and a house into a home. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks as Jake helped each sister down from the wagon, noting how they maintained their protective formation even in this moment of arrival. Mary stepped down first, her movements graceful despite her obvious fatigue, immediately turning to assist Grace while keeping one eye on Jake's reactions. Catherine accepted his help reluctantly, her posture suggesting she was prepared for trouble despite his courteous behavior. Elizabeth moved with her characteristic gentleness, but Jake caught the steel beneath her soft exterior as she evaluated their new surroundings. Margaret's descent was efficient and purposeful, her mind already working on the practical challenges of establishing 7 women in quarters designed for a single bachelor. Rose hesitated slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of change their lives had undergone in a single day, but Anne's steady presence provided the encouragement she needed. Grace, despite being the youngest, showed remarkable composure as she took in their new home, her natural optimism beginning to reassert itself now that they had escaped the immediate threat of separation or abuse. The house rose before them like a promise, its stone foundation and timber frame speaking of permanence and security that had been absent from their lives for too long. Jake's uncle had built with both practicality and ambition, creating a dwelling that could house a large family while withstanding the harsh weather that characterized mountain winters. The covered porch wrapped around 2 sides of the structure, providing outdoor living space that would be valuable during the warmer months ahead. Jake gestured toward the entrance, his movements betraying a nervousness that seemed incongruous with his earlier confidence. "Welcome to the Broken Wheel Ranch," he said simply, his voice carrying a formality that suggested he was as uncertain about their new arrangements as they were. "The house has 8 bedrooms, though several will need work to make them properly comfortable. There's a large kitchen, dining room, and common areas where we can gather for meals and conversation." Mary stepped forward, assuming her natural role as family spokesperson, despite the legal reality that Jake now held authority over their lives. "Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, "we appreciate your generosity in keeping us together and providing what appears to be comfortable accommodations. We want to make clear that we intend to earn our keep through honest work and cooperation. We are not seeking charity, but partnership in making this arrangement successful for everyone involved." Her words established the tone the sisters hoped to maintain, emphasizing their willingness to contribute while preserving their dignity and self-respect. They understood their legal status as indentured servants, but they hoped to establish a relationship based on mutual respect rather than mere compliance with contractual obligations. Mary's diplomatic phrasing acknowledged Jake's authority while asserting their intention to be active participants rather than passive recipients of his protection. Jake nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Mary's approach and appreciating her ability to articulate their position clearly and respectfully. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," he replied. "This ranch has been operated by one person for 3 years, and it's reached the limits of what individual effort can accomplish. 7 additional workers, even inexperienced ones, represent an opportunity for growth and improvement that I could never achieve alone. Your success will be my success, and I intend to provide whatever support and guidance you need to make that possible." Catherine, whose protective instincts remained on high alert despite Jake's reassuring words, stepped closer to Mary with the unconscious movement of someone prepared to defend her family against any threat. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the edge that had marked her contributions throughout their journey, "we need to understand the practical details of our situation. What work will we be expected to perform? What are the rules governing our behavior? What consequences will we face if we fail to meet your expectations?" Her questions were more confrontational than Mary's diplomatic inquiries, but they addressed concerns that all the sisters shared. Catherine had appointed herself as the family's defender, willing to ask difficult questions and challenge potential threats, even when such behavior might create complications. Her approach balanced Mary's diplomacy by ensuring that important issues were addressed directly rather than left to assumption or misunderstanding. Jake appreciated Catherine's directness, understanding that her aggressive questioning stemmed from genuine concern for her sister's welfare rather than personal hostility toward him. "The work will depend on your individual skills and interests," he replied calmly. "Ranch operations include livestock care, fence maintenance, hay production, garden management, and household duties. I expect each of you to contribute according to your abilities while learning new skills that will benefit both the ranch and your own future prospects." Elizabeth, whose gentle nature often concealed sharp intelligence, asked the question that addressed their most immediate concern. "Mr. Sullivan, what about our living arrangements? How will privacy and safety be maintained in a household that includes 7 women and 1 man?" Her inquiry reflected not just personal concerns, but practical understanding that their reputation and future prospects depended on maintaining proper appearances and avoiding any suggestion of impropriety. Jake had anticipated this question, knowing that their living arrangements would be scrutinized by neighbors and territorial officials, who would judge both his character and their situation based on how such matters were handled. "The house was designed with family living in mind," he explained. "The master bedroom, which I currently occupy, is separated from the other rooms by the main staircase and common areas. You will have the entire eastern wing, 7 bedrooms with locks on the doors and complete privacy. Common areas will be shared, but personal spaces will be absolutely respected. Margaret's practical mind immediately began calculating the logistics of housing 7 women in quarters that had presumably been empty for years. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "what condition are these rooms in currently? Will we need to perform significant cleaning or repairs before they are habitable? Do you have adequate furnishings, or will we need to make arrangements for beds, storage, and other necessities?" Her questions revealed the kind of forward thinking that had kept the O'Brien family functioning during their months of crisis. Margaret understood that the success of their arrangement would depend on countless practical details, and she was prepared to address those challenges methodically rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. Her approach impressed Jake with its combination of realism and constructive problem-solving. "The rooms have been unused since my uncle's death," Jake admitted. "They'll need cleaning, and several will require furniture. I can provide materials and tools for any necessary repairs, and we can work together to make them comfortable. It will take time and effort, but the house was built to accommodate a large family, and it can certainly serve that purpose again with proper preparation." Rose, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation while struggling with her own emotional responses to their changed circumstances, finally spoke up with the hesitant voice of someone whose dreams had been shattered and were slowly beginning to reform. "Mr. Sullivan, will there be opportunities for pursuits beyond work? Reading, music, creative activities that might help us maintain our spirits during difficult times?" Her question revealed vulnerabilities that her sister's more practical inquiries had not addressed, touching on emotional and spiritual needs that were just as important as physical comfort and safety. Rose's artistic nature required beauty and creative expression to flourish, and the absence of such opportunities could lead to depression and despair that would ultimately affect the entire family's well-being. Jake's response showed an understanding of human nature that went beyond simple ranch management. "There's a library in the house that hasn't been used in years," he said gently. "Books, musical instruments, and materials for various crafts and hobbies. My aunt was an educated woman who believed in cultivating the mind as well as managing practical affairs. You're welcome to use anything you find there, and if there are specific materials or supplies you need for creative pursuits, we can discuss obtaining them." Anne, whose domestic expertise had sustained the family through their darkest periods, asked about the kitchen facilities and food supplies, understanding that feeding 8 people would require significantly more planning and resources than Jake's current arrangements. "Mr. Sullivan, what are the current provisions for cooking and food storage? Will we be expected to manage all household duties, or will you maintain responsibility for certain areas of domestic management?" Her inquiry addressed both practical concerns and questions of authority, seeking to understand how domestic responsibilities would be divided and whether the sisters would have autonomy in managing household affairs. Anne's skills in this area represented one of their most valuable contributions to the ranch's operation, but she needed to understand the scope of her authority and the resources available for her use. "The kitchen is well equipped but has been neglected," Jake replied. "Food supplies will need significant expansion to feed 8 people, and I'll provide funds for purchasing whatever is needed. I expect you to take primary responsibility for household management, cooking, and related duties, with complete authority to organize those activities as you see fit. My role will be to provide resources and support rather than detailed supervision." Grace, whose youthful perspective often revealed insights that adults missed, asked about their connection to the outside world and their freedom to maintain relationships beyond the ranch. "Mr. Sullivan, will we be able to receive visitors and maintain correspondence with friends from town? Can we attend church services or community gatherings when appropriate?" Her question addressed concerns about isolation and social connection that were particularly important for young women whose futures would eventually extend beyond their current arrangement. Grace understood intuitively that maintaining ties to the broader community would be essential for their long-term well-being and future prospects, regardless of how comfortable their life at the ranch might become. Jake's answer demonstrated his understanding that the sisters were not prisoners, but indentured workers whose human rights extended beyond mere physical care. "You are free to maintain whatever social connections you choose," he assured them. Church attendance, correspondence, and appropriate visitors are not just permitted but encouraged. This ranch is your home, not your prison, and you have the right to live as full a life as circumstances allow. As the conversation continued, Jake found himself impressed by the intelligence and thoughtfulness of the questions the sisters posed. Their concerns went well beyond simple self-interest, encompassing the practical, emotional, and social aspects of their situation with a sophistication that suggested they would be valuable partners in building the kind of life he had never dared to imagine possible. Each sister brought different strengths and perspectives to their unusual family, creating a dynamic that could enrich everyone's experience if properly nurtured and supported. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade as they concluded their initial discussion and prepared to enter the house that would become their home for the next 5 years. Jake carried their few possessions while the sisters gathered around Mary for a whispered conference that allowed them to share initial impressions and concerns away from their new employer's hearing. Their body language suggested cautious optimism, mixed with continued wariness, a realistic assessment of their situation that balanced hope with practical caution. As they crossed the threshold of the Broken Wheel Ranch House, 7 sisters and 1 lonely cowboy began the complex process of transforming strangers into family, legal arrangements into genuine partnership, and a bachelor's retreat into a home that could nurture the dreams and aspirations of 8 very different people who had been brought together by circumstances none of them could have anticipated or planned. The interior of the Broken Wheel Ranch House spoke of prosperity tempered by loneliness, comfort undermined by neglect. Jake's uncle had built with generous proportions and quality materials, creating rooms that could accommodate large gatherings and family celebrations, but 3 years of bachelor living had reduced the space to functional efficiency rather than welcoming warmth. Dust sheets covered furniture that hadn't been used since the funeral, while cobwebs decorated corners that had once hosted laughter and conversation. The smell of disuse hung in the air like a melancholy perfume, reminding everyone present of dreams deferred and potential unrealized. Mary O'Brien stepped into the main hallway with the measured grace of someone who had learned to assess new situations quickly and thoroughly. Her trained eye cataloged the house's possibilities while noting its current deficiencies, understanding immediately that transforming this bachelor dwelling into a proper home for 8 people would require considerable work and organization. The bones of the structure were sound, promising comfort and security once the accumulated neglect was addressed, but the task ahead would test everyone's patience and determination. The main floor opened into a spacious living area dominated by a massive stone fireplace that could heat the entire central portion of the house during winter months. Heavy wooden furniture arranged for solitary use would need rearranging to accommodate group gatherings, while windows that had been left uncurtained for privacy would require proper coverings, now that 7 young women would be sharing the space. The potential was obvious, but realizing it would demand both physical labor and creative vision. Catherine's inspection focused on security considerations and defensive positions, her military mindset evaluating the house as either fortress or trap, depending on circumstances. She noted the locations of all exits, the sight lines from various windows, and the structural features that could provide protection or concealment if threats materialized. Her assessment was thorough and professional, reflecting training that her sisters didn't fully understand but had learned to trust during their months of vulnerability following their parents' death. The kitchen revealed Jake's uncle's ambitious Plans for family life, equipped with a massive wood-burning stove, spacious work surfaces, and storage capacity that could support serious food preparation and preservation. However, years of minimal use had left the space functional but uninviting, lacking the warmth and organization that characterized kitchens managed by women who understood the art of domestic efficiency. Anne's experienced eye immediately began, planning the reorganization and deep cleaning that would be necessary to make the space suitable for feeding 8 people on a daily basis. Elizabeth's gentle nature responded to the house's underlying beauty despite its current condition. Seeing past the dust and neglect to the warm family home it could become with proper care and attention. Her nurturing instincts were already planning improvements that would create comfort and beauty without excessive expense, using creativity and hard work to transform utilitarian spaces into welcoming environments where people could find rest and renewal after demanding days. The dining room impressed everyone with its size and potential, featuring a table that could seat 12 people comfortably and built-in storage for dishes, linens, and serving pieces. Jake's aunt had clearly envisioned hosting large gatherings and holiday celebrations, creating a space designed for community and family fellowship. The room needed cleaning and minor repairs, but it possessed the kind of generous proportions that would allow the enlarged household to gather for meals and conversations that could build the relationships necessary for their unusual arrangement to succeed. Margaret's practical intelligence immediately began calculating the resources and labor required to make the house fully functional for their needs. She noted areas where repairs were necessary, estimated the cost of furnishing the unused bedrooms, and mentally organized the cleaning and organizing tasks that would need to be completed before they could settle into comfortable routines. Her assessment was methodical and realistic, focusing on priorities and timelines that would ensure steady progress without overwhelming anyone with impossible expectations. Jake led them up the main staircase to the second floor, where 7 bedrooms awaited conversion from storage spaces back to their intended purpose as private quarters. The rooms varied in size and condition, but all possessed adequate space for individual occupancy, along with windows that provided natural light and ventilation. Most contained basic furnishings covered by dust sheets, while others were completely empty, requiring beds, storage, and personal touches that would make them feel like homes rather than mere sleeping quarters. Rose's artistic eye was drawn to the architectural details that elevated the house above mere functional construction, noting the carved woodwork, decorative moldings, and carefully proportioned spaces that showed her uncle's commitment to creating beauty as well as utility. Her sensitive nature responded to the craftsmanship and care that had gone into the original construction, seeing possibilities for restoring the house's intended grandeur through attention to details that others might overlook as unimportant. Luxuries. The master bedroom, Jake's current quarters, occupied the western end of the house with privacy, created by distance and architectural barriers rather than locks and walls. The arrangement would provide necessary separation between his living space and the sisters' quarters, while maintaining access to common areas for shared meals and activities. His room was spartanly furnished and meticulously clean, reflecting the habits of someone who had learned military discipline and never quite abandoned its standards, even in civilian life. Anne's domestic expertise allowed her to envision the daily routines that would govern their life in the house, planning traffic patterns, work schedules, and organizational systems that would minimize conflicts while maximizing efficiency. Her experience managing a household during crisis had taught her that success depended on clear expectations and consistent routines, elements that would be even more critical in their current situation, where 8 strong personalities needed to cooperate in close quarters. Grace's youthful enthusiasm responded to the house's potential for adventure and discovery, seeing unexplored rooms and hidden spaces as opportunities for excitement rather than merely additional work. Her natural optimism was infectious, reminding her sisters that their situation, however challenging, represented freedom from the immediate threats they had faced and possibilities for growth and learning that had been absent from their recent struggle for survival. The library that Jake had mentioned proved to be a treasure trove of books, musical instruments, and educational materials that reflected his aunt's broad interests and commitment to intellectual development. Leather-bound volumes on subjects, ranging from literature to agriculture, filled built-in shelves, while a piano in need of tuning occupied one corner, near windows that would provide excellent light for reading or correspondence. The room represented possibilities for evening entertainment and personal enrichment that could make their isolated location feel less like exile and more like sanctuary. Jake's explanation of the house's history revealed the dreams and disappointments that had shaped its development, helping the sisters understand both its potential and its emotional significance to their new employer. His uncle and aunt had immigrated from Germany with plans for a large family and prosperous ranch, building generously and planning optimistically for a future that never quite materialized as they had envisioned. The house stood as testimony to their hopes while serving as a reminder that dreams required both vision and persistence to achieve. The practical tour concluded in the kitchen, where Jake opened cabinets and storage areas to show the sisters what supplies were currently available and what would need to be purchased to support their expanded household. His inventory was adequate for one person living simply, but feeding 8 people would require significant expansion of both staples and cooking equipment. Anne's quick assessment suggested that a trip to town for supplies would be necessary within the next few days, along with planning for longer-term food storage and preservation. As evening approached and the sisters began to settle into their new environment, the complexity of their situation became more apparent to everyone involved. Jake found himself responsible for people whose personalities, needs, and capabilities he was only beginning to understand, while the sisters faced the challenge of creating functional relationships with both their employer and each other, in circumstances none of them had anticipated or prepared for. The legal framework of their arrangement provided structure, but the emotional and practical success of their unusual family would depend on factors that no contract could address or guarantee. Mary's natural leadership qualities emerged as she organized her sisters' responses to their new situation, assigning priorities and coordinating efforts in ways that demonstrated her experience managing crisis situations. Her ability to maintain family unity while adapting to changing circumstances would be crucial to their success, requiring diplomatic skills that could balance Jake's authority with her sister's need for autonomy and dignity. The next few days would test her ability to guide her family through their transition, while establishing patterns that could sustain them through years of shared living. Catherine's protective instincts remained on high alert despite Jake's courteous behavior and comfortable accommodations, understanding that their safety ultimately depended on his character and intentions rather than legal protections or physical security. Her wariness served a valuable function for the family, ensuring that someone remained alert to potential threats, while others focused on adaptation and cooperation. Her challenge would be learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and destructive suspicion as they built trust through daily interactions. Elizabeth's gentle nature would prove essential to creating the emotional warmth necessary for their house to become a true home, but her effectiveness would depend on finding ways to contribute her nurturing qualities without being overwhelmed by the practical demands of ranch life. Her sensitivity to others' needs and feelings could help resolve conflicts and build the relationships necessary for long-term success, but only if she learned to balance empathy with the firmness sometimes required in difficult situations. Margaret's intellectual gifts would be crucial to managing the complex logistics of their expanded household, but her practical intelligence needed to be complemented by emotional wisdom as she navigated relationships that combined legal obligations with personal feelings. Her ability to analyze problems and develop solutions would benefit everyone. But success would require learning to consider human factors as well as efficiency and economy in her planning and decision-making. Rose's artistic temperament brought beauty and creativity to their group, but her sensitive nature made her vulnerable to the emotional stresses that would inevitably arise as 8 strong personalities learn to live together in harmony. Her contribution to their community's emotional well-being could be invaluable, but she would need support and protection from her sisters as she adapted to the harsh realities of frontier life and developed the resilience necessary for survival and growth. Anne's domestic skills represented one of their most immediately valuable assets, but her expertise would be tested by the challenges of managing a household far larger and more complex than anything she had previously handled. Her success would directly impact everyone's comfort and well-being, making her role crucial to their arrangement's success, while placing significant pressure on her to perform consistently under demanding circumstances. Grace's youth and optimism brought energy and hope to their group, but her inexperience with serious responsibilities meant she would need careful guidance as she learned to contribute meaningfully to their shared enterprise. Her natural enthusiasm could inspire others during difficult times, but she would also need protection from disappointments and setbacks that could crush her spirit if not properly managed. Jake's role as both employer and protector required him to balance authority with understanding, maintaining necessary control while respecting the sisters' dignity and individual needs. His success would depend on learning to see them as partners in building a successful life, rather than merely workers fulfilling contractual obligations. The next few days would establish patterns and relationships that would determine whether his extraordinary investment would prove wise or foolish. As night fell over the Broken Wheel Ranch, 8 people prepared to begin a new chapter in their lives, each bringing different strengths and vulnerabilities to an arrangement that defied conventional expectations. The house that had sheltered one lonely man for 3 years was about to become home to a family created by legal necessity rather than blood or marriage, but potentially capable of developing bonds stronger than many relationships based on traditional foundations. The challenges ahead would test everyone's character, patience, and commitment to making their unusual situation work, despite obstacles and complications none of them could fully anticipate. Success would require not just hard work and cooperation, but the development of trust, respect, and affection among people who had become family through extraordinary circumstances rather than natural affection. The first evening's conversations, over a simple meal prepared by Anne, with assistance from her sisters, revealed both the potential and the pitfalls of their arrangement. Personalities that had been subdued during the trauma of the auction began to emerge more clearly, showing Jake glimpses of the intelligence, humor, and strength that each sister brought to their collective endeavor. Their interactions demonstrated the deep bonds that held them together while hinting at individual differences that would need to be accommodated and managed. As they prepared for their first night under Jake's roof, the 7 sisters gathered in Mary's room for a whispered conference that allowed them to share impressions and concerns away from their employer's hearing. Their assessment was cautiously optimistic, recognizing that Jake appeared to be an honorable man whose intentions seemed genuinely focused on their welfare rather than exploitation. However, they understood that judgments based on first impressions could prove wrong, and vigilance would remain necessary until his character was proven through consistent behavior over time. Jake, meanwhile, sat alone in his study contemplating the magnitude of the changes that $300 and a moment of moral clarity had brought to his carefully ordered existence. The house that had been his refuge from the world's complications was about to become a community center requiring diplomacy, patience, and leadership skills he wasn't certain he possessed. His decision to purchase the sisters' freedom had been driven by instinct and principle, but making their arrangement succeed would require planning and effort that would challenge him in ways Military service had never demanded. The first week would establish routines and relationships that would either foundation for long-term success or create problems that could undermine their entire endeavor. 8 strong personalities would need to find ways to live together harmoniously while accomplishing the work necessary to maintain and improve the ranch's operations. The legal framework provided structure, but the emotional success of their unusual family would depend on factors that no contract could address or guarantee. As the Broken Wheel Ranch settled into its first night as home to the O'Brien sisters, the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story waiting for its characters to determine whether their tale would become one of triumph over adversity or another frontier tragedy of dreams destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The next few days would begin to provide answers to questions that everyone was asking, but no one dared voice too directly. Dawn broke over the Broken Wheel Ranch with the crystalline clarity that only mountain air could provide, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise hope after the uncertainty of the previous day. Jake Sullivan stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cold morning air, watching smoke rise from the kitchen chimney where Ann O'Brien had risen before sunrise to begin preparing breakfast for 8 people instead of the solitary meals that had marked his existence for 3 years. The sight of that domestic smoke carried more significance than any legal document, representing the transformation of his bachelor retreat into something approaching a real home. Inside the house, the 7 sisters moved through their morning routines with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to function as a unit during months of crisis and uncertainty. Mary had awakened first, as was her habit, checking on each of her sisters before beginning her own preparations for the day. The responsibility of family leadership had fallen to her naturally after their parents' death, and she carried that burden with the grace of someone who understood that strength was measured not by individual capability, but by the ability to hold others together when circumstances threatened to tear them apart. Catherine's morning inspection of the house and grounds revealed defensive positions and potential vulnerabilities that her military mindset cataloged automatically, though she was beginning to hope that such knowledge might prove unnecessary in their current situation. Her protective instincts remained on high alert, but Jake's behavior during their first evening together had begun to earn her grudging respect, if not complete trust. The man seemed genuinely concerned with their welfare rather than simply their labor, a distinction that could make the difference between tolerable servitude and something approaching genuine partnership. Elizabeth had spent the early morning hours exploring the neglected gardens behind the house, her gentle hands assessing the condition of plants that had survived without care and planning the restoration work that could transform utilitarian space into beauty that would nourish both body and spirit. Her nurturing nature responded to the evidence of growth and life despite neglect, seeing parallels to her own family's survival through hardship and their potential for flourishing under proper care and attention. The kitchen had become Anne's domain by unspoken agreement, her domestic expertise transforming the space from functional utility into the warm heart of their new home. She had risen before dawn to prepare breakfast for 8 people, a task that required significant adjustment from her previous experience, feeding 5 sisters on whatever supplies they could afford. The abundance of ingredients available to her represented luxury beyond anything she had experienced since their parents' death, and she approached the work with gratitude mixed with determination to prove their worth through competent service. Margaret's practical intelligence had spent the previous evening calculating the resources and labor required to make their living situation fully functional, and this morning found her organizing cleaning supplies and planning the systematic restoration of the unused bedrooms. Her methodical approach to problem-solving had kept their family functioning during crisis, and she applied those same skills to their current challenge of establishing comfortable quarters for 7 women in spaces that had been empty for years. Rose had discovered the library during her exploration of the house, and the abundance of books, musical instruments, and art supplies had awakened hopes for creative expression that had been dormant during their months of mere survival. Her artistic temperament had struggled with the harsh realities of poverty and loss, but the possibility of beauty and culture in their new life represented healing that could restore both her spirit and her ability to contribute joy to their family's daily existence. Grace, whose 16 years had been marked by more hardship than most adults experienced in a lifetime, had found herself drawn to the windows that overlooked the horse pastures, where animals represented freedom and possibility that had been absent from her recent experience. Her natural optimism, though tested by circumstances, was beginning to reassert itself as she contemplated the opportunities for learning and growth that their new situation might provide. Jake's morning routine had been disrupted by the sounds of activity throughout the house, voices and movement that reminded him of childhood visits to relatives with large families, when houses came alive with purpose and energy rather than the echoing silence that had characterized his adult existence. The adjustment required more than simply accommodating additional people. It demanded fundamental changes in how he approached daily life, work schedules, and the countless decisions that had been simple when he was accountable only to himself. The first crisis of their new arrangement emerged during breakfast, when Catherine's direct questioning about their work assignments and expectations created tension that threatened to establish adversarial patterns rather than the cooperative relationships necessary for long-term success. Her protective instincts, while valuable for family security, could become destructive if they prevented the trust building that their unusual situation required to function effectively. Jake's response to Catherine's challenge demonstrated wisdom that went beyond simple ranch management, acknowledging her concerns while establishing boundaries that respected both his authority and her dignity. His military experience had taught him that leadership required earning respect rather than simply demanding obedience, and his approach to managing their household reflected that understanding despite the legal framework that gave him complete control over their lives. The morning's work assignments revealed the individual strengths and capabilities that each sister brought to their collective endeavor, along with areas where training and development would be necessary to maximize their contributions. Mary's natural leadership qualities made her an obvious choice for coordinating domestic activities, while Catherine's protective instincts and physical strength suited her for outdoor work that required both skill and vigilance. Elizabeth's gentle nature and intuitive understanding of living things made her ideal for managing the gardens and any livestock that required careful handling, while Margaret's organizational skills and practical intelligence positioned her to manage supplies, scheduling, and the countless details that determined whether their expanded household functioned smoothly or descended into chaos. Anne's domestic expertise was immediately apparent in the kitchen, where her experience and creativity transformed simple ingredients into meals that nourished both body and spirit. But her talents extended beyond cooking to include the household management skills that would be essential for maintaining their quality of life during the demanding seasons ahead. Rose's artistic sensibilities might have seemed like luxuries in their practical situation, but Jake recognized that beauty and culture were necessities for maintaining morale and human dignity, especially during the long winter months when isolation and close quarters could strain even the strongest relationships. Her abilities to create joy and meaning through creative expression would prove valuable in ways that purely practical skills could not address. Grace's youth and enthusiasm brought energy and hope to their group, but her inexperience with serious responsibilities meant she would need careful guidance as she learned to contribute meaningfully to their shared enterprise. Her natural optimism could inspire others during difficult times, but she would also need protection from disappointments and setbacks that could crush her spirit if not properly managed. As the morning progressed, Jake found himself impressed by the sisters' willingness to tackle unfamiliar tasks with determination and intelligence. asking questions that revealed their desire to understand rather than simply comply with instructions. Their approach to learning suggested that his investment in their freedom might prove more valuable than he had initially realized, not just as a moral gesture, but as a practical decision that could benefit everyone involved. The revelation that changed everything came during their second week at the ranch, when a visit from territorial officials brought news that transformed their understanding of the circumstances that had led to their current arrangement. Samuel Rodriguez, Jake's neighboring rancher, arrived with Judge Hayes and Marshal Carter, their expressions indicating that their mission involved more than social courtesy or routine territorial business. The conversation that followed revealed corruption and conspiracy that extended far beyond the simple debt collection that had brought the O'Brien sisters to auction, involving territorial officials, mining companies, and business leaders who had been using debt settlements to acquire valuable labor while enriching themselves through legal manipulation and fraud. The sisters' father had been targeted not just for his borrowing, but for his knowledge of mining claims and territorial surveys that made him valuable to competing interests. The evidence presented by the officials indicated that Seamus O'Brien had been murdered rather than killed in a mining accident, eliminated by forces that wanted to acquire his land and silence his potential testimony about illegal activities he had witnessed during his work for various mining operations. The debt that had brought his daughters to auction was largely fabricated, inflated through false charges and manipulated interest rates that had no basis in their actual financial obligations. The legal implications of these revelations were staggering, invalidating the sisters' indenture contracts and exposing the corruption that had enabled their exploitation, along with that of countless other families throughout the territory. Jake's purchase of their freedom, intended as a moral gesture, had inadvertently protected them from forces that would have used their vulnerability for purposes far more sinister than simple labor exploitation. The sisters' reaction to learning the truth about their father's death and their family's financial situation revealed the strength and unity that had sustained them through months of uncertainty and hardship. Rather than being overwhelmed by grief or anger, they channeled their emotions into determination to see justice done and to help expose the corruption that had destroyed their family and threatened countless others. Mary's leadership qualities proved essential in coordinating their family's response to the crisis, working with territorial officials to provide information and testimony that could help build cases against the criminals who had targeted their father and manipulated their situation. Her ability to maintain family unity while pursuing justice demonstrated the strength of character that had made her an effective leader during their darkest times. Catherine's protective instincts found appropriate outlets in helping to plan security measures and defensive strategies that would protect their family from retaliation while they cooperated with the investigation. Her military mindset, which had sometimes created tension in their daily routines, proved valuable in dealing with threats that required tactical thinking and strategic planning. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy that extended throughout the territorial government, involving judges, territorial officials, and business leaders who had been using their positions to enrich themselves while exploiting vulnerable families. The sisters' testimony became crucial evidence in cases that would ultimately result in dozens of arrests and convictions, transforming them from victims into heroes of territorial justice. Jake's role in protecting the sisters during this dangerous period earned him respect and admiration from territorial officials who recognized that his actions had prevented a tragedy and preserved evidence that was essential for exposing the corruption. His ranch became a safe haven for the sisters while they provided testimony and waited for the legal proceedings that would determine their future and that of many other families. The financial compensation that resulted from the legal victories provided the sisters with independence and security that they had never imagined possible, along with the satisfaction of knowing that their suffering had contributed to justice for others who had been similarly exploited. The money represented not just material comfort, but vindication of their father's memory and proof that good could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. The transformation of their relationship with Jake from legal obligation to genuine partnership reflected the trust and affection that had developed during their months of shared danger and mutual support. What had begun as a rescue mission had evolved into something deeper, based on respect, understanding, and the recognition that their unusual family had become stronger than many relationships based on traditional foundations. Mary's decision to remain at the ranch permanently, despite her newfound freedom and financial independence, represented more than practical convenience or gratitude for Jake's protection. Her feelings for the man who had saved her family had developed into something deeper, based on shared values, mutual respect, and the recognition that their partnership could benefit everyone involved. The wedding that followed was a celebration not just of personal happiness, but of triumph over adversity, justice over corruption, and the power of decent people to make a difference when they chose to act according to their principles rather than their immediate interests. The territorial officials who had worked on the case attended the ceremony, along with neighbors and friends who had been inspired by the family's courage and determination. Catherine's gradual acceptance of Jake as a brother-in-law reflected her recognition that his actions had proven his character in ways that words never could, earning the trust and respect that she granted to very few people. Her protective instincts remained intact, but they were now directed toward preserving the family happiness that had emerged from their shared struggles rather than defending against threats that had been eliminated. The other sisters' decisions about their futures reflected their individual personalities and the opportunities that their newfound freedom had created. Elizabeth chose to remain at the ranch, where her nurturing nature and love of growing things could contribute to the expansion of their agricultural operations. Margaret decided to pursue education that would prepare her for a career in territorial government, using her intelligence and experience to help protect other families from exploitation. Anne's domestic skills made her valuable to the ranch operations, but her real joy came from managing the household that had become a gathering place for territorial officials, neighboring families, and travelers who sought refuge and hospitality. In a dangerous and often hostile environment, her ability to create comfort and welcome for others represented a form of service that enriched everyone's lives. Rose's artistic talents flourished in the security and encouragement that their new life provided, creating works that captured the beauty of their mountain valley while documenting the struggles and triumphs of frontier life. Her paintings and writings became valuable records of territorial history while providing inspiration and joy to everyone who encountered them. Grace's education and development under Jake's guidance and her sister's protection prepared her for a future that offered possibilities no one could have imagined during their darkest times. Her natural optimism and intelligence, nurtured by security and opportunity, positioned her to contribute significantly to whatever pursuits she chose to embrace. The Broken Wheel Ranch became a symbol of hope and possibility throughout the territory, proof that decent people could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances through courage, determination, and mutual support. The story of the lonely cowboy who had paid $300 for 7 sisters at auction became legend, inspiring others to act according to their principles rather than their immediate interests. The legacy of their unusual family extended far beyond their personal happiness, contributing to territorial reforms that protected vulnerable families from exploitation while providing opportunities for education, economic development, and social progress that benefited everyone in the Kika region. Their story became part of the territorial history, documented in Rose's artistic works and remembered in the countless lives that were improved, because 8 people had chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy and loss. Years later, when territorial officials and historians looked back on the events that had transformed their region from a lawless frontier into a civilized community, they would point to the auction in Cedar Falls as a turning point when one Man's Moral Courage and Seven Sisters. Determination had exposed corruption and inspired reform that changed countless lives for the better. The house that had sheltered one lonely man for 3 years had become home to a family that contributed significantly to their community's development, proving that the most important investments were not measured in dollars, but in the human connections that gave meaning to wealth and success. The Broken Wheel Ranch represented not just agricultural prosperity, but the values of justice, compassion, and mutual support that made civilization possible in even the most challenging circumstances. The story of Jake Sullivan and the O'Brien sisters demonstrated that extraordinary circumstances could create extraordinary opportunities for good, but only when people chose to act according to their highest principles rather than their immediate interests. Their legacy lived on in the reforms they had helped inspire, the community they had helped build, and the example they had set for others facing similar challenges in their own lives. As the sun set over the valley that had become their home, the family gathered on the porch of the house that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to something stronger than blood relatives, proof that the most important families were those created by choice, sustained by love, and strengthened by shared commitment to building something better than what they had inherited from the past. 5 years had transformed the Broken Wheel Ranch from a solitary outpost into the beating heart of Cedar Falls community, where neighbors gathered to celebrate victories and support each other through hardships. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with laughter, music, and the conversations of a family that had proven love could flourish even in soil watered by tears and hardship. Jake Sullivan, no longer the isolated rancher who had bid on Seven Sisters at auction, had become a respected leader whose wisdom was sought by territorial officials and neighboring families facing their own challenges. The wedding of Mary O'Brien to Jake Sullivan had been the social event of the territorial season, attended by government officials, reformed criminals who had testified against the corruption network, and ordinary families who had been inspired by their story of triumph over adversity. The ceremony took place in the ranch's main yard, decorated with flowers that Elizabeth had cultivated in gardens that now fed half the valley, while Rose's artistic touches transformed the practical space into something approaching cathedral beauty. Catherine had surprised everyone by accepting a proposal from Marshall Carter, whose investigation of territorial corruption had revealed a man whose commitment to justice matched her own fierce protection of those she loved. Their partnership combined his legal authority with her tactical intelligence, creating a formidable team that continued the work of exposing and eliminating the criminal networks that preyed on vulnerable families throughout the region. Elizabeth's marriage to Dr. Benjamin Carter brought medical expertise to their valley, establishing a clinic that served families for 50 miles in every direction while providing the gentle healer with a partner whose nurturing nature complemented his scientific knowledge. Their union represented the marriage of practical service with emotional wisdom, creating healing that addressed both physical ailments and the spiritual wounds that frontier life could inflict on even the strongest souls. Margaret had indeed pursued her education, becoming the first woman elected to territorial legislature on a platform of family protection and government reform. Her practical intelligence and first-hand experience with corruption made her an effective advocate for laws that prevented the exploitation that had destroyed so many families, while her political success inspired other women to seek roles in territorial governance. Anne's domestic expertise had evolved into a business empire that supplied prepared foods, preserved goods, and household services to mining camps, railroad construction crews, and new settlements throughout the territory. Her success proved that traditional women's work possessed economic value when properly organized and marketed, creating employment opportunities for dozens of other women, while establishing financial independence that protected families from exploitation. Rose's artistic talents had made her the territorial's most celebrated painter and chronicler, creating works that documented the struggles and triumphs of frontier families while capturing the beauty of mountain landscapes that attracted settlers from across the nation. Her paintings were displayed in territorial capitals and eastern museums, bringing recognition to their region while providing income that supported her continued creative work. Grace, now 21 and educated far beyond what most frontier women could achieve, had chosen to establish a school that served children throughout their valley, teaching not just basic subjects, but the critical thinking skills that could protect future generations from the manipulation and exploitation that had threatened their own family. Her natural optimism had matured into wisdom that inspired her students while providing hope for continued progress. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Jake's uncle's wildest dreams, expanding from a modest cattle operation into a diversified enterprise that included horse breeding, agricultural production, and processing facilities that served the entire region. The success was shared among all family members, proving that cooperation could achieve more than individual effort while creating prosperity that lifted everyone rather than enriching only those at the top. The territorial investigations that had begun with the sisters' testimony had ultimately resulted in 47 convictions, the dismantling of 3 criminal networks, and the recovery of over $2 million in stolen property and fraudulent claims. The legal precedents established during these cases had created protections for vulnerable families while establishing accountability standards for territorial officials that prevented future corruption. Jake's reputation as a man who had risked everything to protect innocent people had made him a natural choice for territorial positions that required both integrity and practical wisdom. His service on various commissions and advisory boards was voluntary but influential, helping to shape policies that balanced economic development with social justice while protecting the rights of families and individuals who might otherwise be exploited by powerful interests. The family gatherings that had become monthly traditions at the Broken Wheel Ranch attracted visitors from throughout the territory, creating networks of friendship and mutual support that strengthened communities, while providing examples of successful cooperation across ethnic, religious, and economic boundaries. These celebrations demonstrated that diversity was a source of strength, rather than division when people chose to focus on shared values rather than superficial differences. The children who had begun arriving in the extended family represented hope for the future, growing up in an environment where love was freely given, education was valued, and service to others was considered the highest calling. Their childhood experiences of security and encouragement would prepare them to face whatever challenges the future might bring, while contributing to communities that valued justice, compassion, and mutual support. The letters that continued to arrive from throughout the territory and beyond told stories of families who had been inspired by the Sullivan example to stand against corruption, protect vulnerable members of their communities, and build relationships based on respect rather than exploitation. Each letter represented lives that had been changed because 8 people had chosen to create beauty from the ashes of tragedy and loss. The territorial government's decision to establish the O'Brien Sullivan Institute for Family Protection created a permanent memorial to their father's memory while providing resources for families facing exploitation or abuse. The institute offered legal assistance, temporary shelter, educational opportunities, and the community support necessary for vulnerable people to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. Jake's decision to document their family's story in collaboration with Rose's artistic skills and Margaret's political insights had created a record that inspired continuing reform while providing hope for families facing similar challenges. Their book became required reading in territorial schools while serving as a manual for officials charged with protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The ranch's transformation into a model of sustainable agriculture and ethical business practices attracted visitors from throughout the nation, demonstrating that prosperity was possible without exploitation, while providing examples that could be replicated in other regions facing similar challenges. Their success proved that the values of justice and compassion were not luxuries, but necessities for building communities that could survive and thrive in challenging environments. The memorial garden that Elizabeth had created to honor their parents' memory had become a place of healing and reflection where families could find comfort during times of loss, while drawing inspiration from the examples of courage and determination that had made their community possible. The garden represented the transformation of grief into growth, proving that even the deepest sorrows could nurture new life when tended with love and patience. The annual auction commemoration that the family had established served as both celebration and reminder, honoring the day when one man's moral courage had changed 8 lives while inspiring others to act according to their highest principles. The event raised funds for the Institute while providing opportunities for community members to recommit themselves to the values of justice, protection, and mutual support that had made their success possible. As Jake stood on his porch on the 10th anniversary of the auction that had changed everything, surrounded by the family that love and circumstances had created, he marveled at the journey that had brought them from desperate circumstances to prosperity and influence that extended throughout the territory. The lonely cowboy who had once avoided human connection had become the patriarch of a family whose influence extended far beyond their valley, proving that the most important investments were measured not in dollars, but in the human connections that gave meaning to wealth and success. The sunset that painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson seemed to promise that their legacy would continue through the children playing in the gardens, the students learning in Grace's school, the families protected by the Institute, and the countless individuals who had been inspired to create their own examples of justice and compassion in communities throughout the territory and beyond. The story that had begun with 7 sisters standing on an auction block had become legend throughout the territory, proving that extraordinary circumstances could create extraordinary opportunities for good when people chose to act according to their highest principles rather than their immediate interests. Their legacy lived on in every family protected from exploitation, every child educated to think critically, every community strengthened by cooperation rather than divided by competition. The Broken Wheel Ranch represented more than agricultural prosperity or family happiness. It stood as proof that civilization was built not by the powerful exploiting the weak, but by ordinary people choosing to protect each other, share their resources, and create communities where everyone could flourish. The house that had sheltered one lonely man for 3 years had become a beacon of hope that would continue shining long after its current inhabitants had passed into memory, inspiring future generations to build upon the foundation of justice and love that had made their success possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.